Go ahead. Laugh while you still can. Sometimes the person you dismiss first is the one whose name everyone else already knows. That was the thought quietly passing through my mind as I stepped out of my sedan and looked up at the warm lights decorating the entrance to Maple Ridge Country Club. My father's retirement celebration, scheduled several weeks before his final day at work, had been planned for months, and everyone who mattered to him seemed to be there. Family members, former co-workers, lifelong neighbors, and even people I barely remembered from childhood filled the elegant ballroom overlooking the golf course. It should have been a joyful evening. It should have been the kind of family gathering where old stories were shared, embarrassing childhood memories became harmless jokes, and everyone left feeling a little closer than before. Instead, I already knew exactly how the night was going to begin. My name is Natalie Young. I am 36 years old, and according to most of my relatives, I am the quiet daughter who never seemed to figure life out. My younger sister, Nora, is 3 years younger, endlessly outgoing, effortlessly charming, and gifted with the kind of confidence that could fill an entire room before she even walked into it. She always dressed as though every family gathering might accidentally become the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Tonight was no different. Even from the parking lot I could see her laughing through the ballroom windows, surrounded by cousins, friends, and her husband, Brandon. She looked perfectly at home under the sparkling chandeliers, greeting guests with practiced warmth while making sure every conversation somehow circled back to her latest achievements. I glanced at my reflection in the car window before locking the door. My navy dress was simple, and my blonde hair was tied neatly into a low ponytail. I had driven nearly 400 miles after finishing another exhausting work assignment because I refused to miss Dad's retirement. I barely had enough time to stop at my apartment for a quick shower before getting back on the road. There had been no opportunity for expensive salon appointments or designer dresses, and honestly, none of that had ever mattered much to me. I locked the car and walked toward the entrance. Before I even reached the reception hall, I heard Nora's unmistakable voice. "Everyone, guess who finally remembered we have a family?" Several people laughed before they even turned around. As I stepped inside, dozens of faces shifted toward me. Some smiled politely. Others simply watched. Nora walked over with a bright smile that somehow never reached her eyes. She hugged me lightly, careful not to wrinkle her elegant outfit, then stepped back just far enough for everyone to take in my appearance. "Long drive?" she asked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "About 400 miles, I answered. "You look like it." More laughter followed. "You could have at least chosen something a little more polished for Dad's retirement party." I smiled politely. I had just enough time to shower and change before driving here because I did not want to miss Dad's celebration. "Well," she replied with an exaggerated shrug, "at least you made it before dessert." Brandon chuckled beside her without saying anything. He was not cruel by nature, but after years of marriage, he had learned that disagreeing with Nora in public usually created more problems than it solved. My mother hurried over and kissed my cheek. "Natalie, sweetheart, we're glad you're here." She paused for a moment before gently smoothing a wrinkle from my sleeve. "Next time, maybe take a little more time for yourself before these events." It was not criticism in her mind. It never was. She simply believed appearances reflected priorities. Nora had always understood that language. I had never cared to speak it. Dad noticed me across the room and smiled with genuine relief. His silver hair seemed almost brighter beneath the ballroom lights, and the happiness in his eyes made the long drive worthwhile. He pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us expected. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course I did. I know how busy you've been. Nothing was going to keep me away tonight." He nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer, never asking the questions everyone else always did. What exactly did I do? Why was I always traveling? Why did I never talk much about work? Why did I disappear for weeks and then return as though nothing unusual had happened? The truth was simple. I had never believed my career belonged at the dinner table. Some people collected accomplishments like trophies. I preferred collecting moments that could stay private. That difference had slowly turned into mystery, and mystery had become assumption. To most of my relatives, I was simply the daughter with an ordinary office job who somehow always looked tired. Throughout the evening, conversations drifted naturally toward success. One cousin talked about buying a vacation home. Another discussed promotions at a technology company. Nora proudly described the luxury SUV she and Brandon had recently purchased and joked that they needed a bigger garage now. Every story seemed carefully measured by square footage, salary, or status. Eventually someone smiled at me. "So, Natalie, are you still renting?" Before I could answer, Nora laughed. "She probably is." Honestly, Natalie has never cared much about money. Or planning. Or keeping people updated. Another round of laughter rolled across the table. I simply lifted my glass of iced tea and smiled. Correcting people had never changed what they wanted to believe. Dad noticed the exchange but was quickly pulled away by another retired colleague wanting a photograph. I watched him smile for the camera, proud, relaxed, finally free after decades of hard work. Tonight was supposed to belong to him. I refused to become the reason anyone remembered something else. I quietly excused myself and walked toward the refreshment table to refill my drink. As I reached for a glass, one of the country club employees suddenly froze when he noticed me. His expression shifted from casual professionalism to unmistakable recognition. Before I could say a word, he straightened his posture instinctively and took one careful step in my direction, as though he intended to greet me very differently from every other guest in the room. I looked up just as the country club employee caught himself. For the briefest moment, surprise crossed his face. Before professional composure returned. "Good evening, ma'am," he said warmly. "It is good to see you again." I recognized him almost immediately. His name tag read Michael, and years earlier I had met him during a regional emergency preparedness conference hosted at the same country club. He had volunteered during one of the large community disaster response exercises and had remembered me ever since. "Good evening, Michael," I replied with an easy smile. "It has been a while." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I hope everything has been going well." "Busy, but good." He glanced toward the ballroom, lowered his voice slightly, and said, "Please let us know if you need anything tonight." Before I could answer, another employee called his name from across the room. He excused himself with a polite nod and returned to work. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it had not gone completely unnoticed. Nora had been watching from across the refreshment table with mild curiosity before quickly dismissing it. "Interesting," she said with a playful grin as she joined me. "The staff seems to know you. I have been here before." "Really? For what?" "Work." She raised one eyebrow. "Office retreats count as work now?" I smiled without correcting her. "Something like that." She laughed softly and picked up a sparkling water. "You really do have a talent for making ordinary things sound mysterious." I simply took a sip of my iced tea. Experience had taught me that explaining rarely changed assumptions that people enjoyed believing. Soon everyone gathered near the banquet tables as dinner was served. My father moved from table to table greeting former co-workers while relatives exchanged stories about vacations, promotions, grandchildren, and retirement plans. The atmosphere gradually relaxed, exactly as my father had hoped. Unfortunately, Nora seemed uncomfortable whenever the conversation was not centered on her. During dinner my cousin Addison smiled at me. "Natalie, your mother said you travel all the time. Do you at least earn enough airline miles to take a nice vacation?" Before I could answer, Nora leaned forward with a laugh. "Vacation? She probably spends more time inside airports than anywhere else." Several relatives chuckled. Brandon smiled politely but kept eating. "Seriously," Nora continued, "I still cannot figure out what Natalie actually does. Every holiday she says she is traveling for work, but somehow nobody ever knows where she has been." Aunt Denise nodded thoughtfully. "That is true. It almost sounds classified." The table laughed again. I smiled. "It is simply a demanding job. Nora waved her hand dramatically. See? That is exactly what I mean. Always vague. My mother looked toward me with genuine concern. Honey, you have worked so hard for years. You really should think about settling down. Find somewhere permanent. Buy a home. Life moves quickly. I know, Mom. Nora has built such a wonderful life, she continued kindly. Sometimes I worry you spend so much time working that you forget to enjoy living. There was no malice in her voice, which somehow made it more difficult to answer. She truly believed success looked exactly like the life Nora had built, and she wanted that happiness for me. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. I appreciate that. She smiled with relief, believing the conversation finished. Across the room, I noticed Michael speaking quietly with the banquet manager. The manager glanced toward our table for only a second before both returned to arranging preparations near the entrance. Michael had evidently mentioned that he recognized me, and the banquet manager had passed that information to the distinguished guests expected at the club that evening. Something about the exchange caught my attention, but there was nothing unusual enough to dwell on. Dinner continued with light conversation until my uncle asked Brandon about his new luxury vehicle. Brandon proudly described every feature while Nora added comments about premium leather seats, custom wheels, and weekend trips to wine country. Eventually she looked at me again. What about you, Natalie? Still driving that little sedan? It gets me where I need to go. Practical as always. She laughed. One day I am going to surprise you with a shopping trip. I think I am doing all right. Maybe, she replied with a teasing smile, but appearances matter more than you think. Before I answered, my father stood and gently tapped his glass with a spoon. The conversations gradually faded into silence. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he began. Retirement feels strange after almost 40 years. But seeing all of you together reminds me how fortunate I have been. Everyone applauded warmly. As he continued sharing memories from his career, I noticed movement through the ballroom windows overlooking the circular driveway. 3 dark executive vehicles slowly entered the property. They were not flashy, but they carried themselves with quiet purpose. Several guests near the windows glanced outside before returning their attention to my father. I thought little of it until Michael hurried discreetly across the room toward the banquet manager once again. The manager immediately adjusted his jacket, checked something on his phone, and quietly instructed several staff members to prepare the front entrance. No announcement was made, and the dinner continued uninterrupted. Halfway through my father's speech, Nora leaned toward me and whispered with excitement, "Someone important must be arriving. Maybe there is a corporate event in one of the other ballrooms." She smiled mischievously. Imagine if it is someone famous. I offered a small smile but said nothing. A few moments later the ballroom doors opened briefly as several elegantly dressed guests entered the reception area outside. They were accompanied by country club staff but remained outside the main banquet room, speaking quietly among themselves. One distinguished silver-haired woman stood near the entrance with calm confidence, scanning the room as though searching for someone. She did not appear hurried or impatient. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. The banquet manager approached her respectfully. She listened, nodded once, then asked him a single question. Although I could not hear every word from where I sat, I caught enough to feel my heartbeat slow for reasons no one else at the table could possibly understand. The manager looked toward our family gathering, hesitated for just a moment, and then began walking directly in my direction. The banquet manager stopped beside my chair with the kind of careful professionalism reserved for guests who expected discretion above all else. He smiled politely without drawing unnecessary attention. "Good evening, Ms. Young," he said quietly. "I hope you are enjoying the evening." "Thank you. My father has been looking forward to this celebration for a long time. We are honored to host it." His tone remained warm but deliberate. "When you have a convenient moment later this evening, one of our guests would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." I nodded calmly. "Of course. There is no urgency," he added. Please enjoy your father's event first. With another respectful nod, he excused himself and returned toward the entrance. The exchange was brief enough that most people barely noticed it, but Nora certainly had. She leaned closer with a puzzled smile. What was that about? Someone wants to say hello later. Someone important, she asked. I am not sure. She narrowed her eyes playfully. You always answer questions without actually answering them. Before I could respond, another round of applause interrupted us as my father finished another story from his career. The room relaxed again, conversations returning to comfortable laughter. I quietly looked toward the entrance where the newly arrived guests remained gathered outside the ballroom. There were 6 of them altogether. Their clothing was elegant without appearing extravagant, and every member of the group carried themselves with remarkable composure. They were clearly accustomed to attending formal events, yet none behaved as though they expected attention. The silver-haired woman who seemed to lead the group briefly glanced into the ballroom again before continuing her conversation with the banquet manager. Meanwhile, Nora had become increasingly curious. I wonder who they are, she whispered to Brandon. Maybe executives from one of the companies that uses this place. Brandon shrugged. Could be. Or politicians, she suggested with growing excitement. Would not that be incredible? She quickly reached for her phone before remembering that my father had requested everyone keep devices away during his speech. With obvious reluctance, she slipped it back into her purse. Across the table, Aunt Denise smiled. Nora, you are always hoping to meet somebody famous. Nora laughed confidently. Networking never hurts. The conversation drifted toward speculation about the arriving guests. One cousin guessed they were investors. Another thought they might be members of a charitable foundation hosting an event elsewhere in the country club. Nobody considered they might have any connection to our family gathering. I preferred it that way. My father stepped down from the podium as guests stood to congratulate him. Several former co-workers formed a line to shake his hand while relatives gathered around for photographs. I stayed back intentionally, giving everyone else their moment first. Dad had spent decades helping other people succeed, and seeing him surrounded by genuine appreciation filled me with quiet happiness. He deserved every kind word spoken that evening. As I watched him laugh with old friends, my mother joined me. He looks happy, she said softly. He really does. She smiled before looking at me with gentle concern. I wish you smiled like that more often. I smile plenty. Not like when you were younger. Her words lingered longer than she realized. There had been a time when I laughed more easily, when work had not demanded so much of my time, and when keeping difficult experiences private had not become second nature. Still, I returned her smile. Tonight is about him. She squeezed my arm affectionately. Thank you for coming all this way. Before either of us said anything more, movement near the ballroom entrance drew nearly every eye in the room. The distinguished silver-haired woman had stepped inside accompanied by 2 colleagues while the others remained outside. She was greeted immediately by the banquet manager, who quietly introduced her to the country club director. Several guests instinctively assumed someone important had arrived. Conversations softened into curious whispers. Nora noticed before anyone else at our table. There she is, she whispered excitedly. Look at everyone gathering around her. Without hesitation, she stood. Brandon looked uncertain. Nora. Relax, she replied. I am only going to introduce myself. Before anyone could stop her, she crossed the ballroom with effortless confidence. She approached the small welcoming group wearing the same polished smile that had opened countless professional doors throughout her career in real estate. From our table I could not hear the conversation, but I watched her extend her hand enthusiastically. The silver-haired woman accepted the greeting with perfect courtesy, exchanging only a few pleasant words before her attention shifted elsewhere. Nora continued speaking, gesturing toward our family as though proudly introducing herself. For just a second she even pointed in my direction. I quietly lowered my eyes to my coffee cup. Whatever assumptions she was making, I doubted it would last long. A moment later the woman politely excused herself and turned back to the banquet manager. Nora returned looking only slightly disappointed but determined to sound optimistic. "Very gracious woman," she announced. "She said they are waiting for someone before joining another event." "Did she tell you who they are?" Addison asked. "Not exactly," Nora admitted. "But they are obviously very important." She laughed lightly. "Maybe if we stay a little longer we will find out." At that exact moment, the silver-haired woman spoke again to the banquet manager. This time her voice carried just enough across the suddenly quieter ballroom for several nearby guests to hear. "I only need to know one thing," she said with calm certainty. "Has Regional Response Commander Natalie Young arrived yet?" The words floated through the room like a sudden change in the air itself. Conversations stopped one by one. Several relatives instinctively looked around, confused by the unfamiliar title. Nora blinked twice before letting out a short laugh. "Commander," she repeated loudly enough for those closest to hear. "There must be another Natalie Young. It certainly cannot be my sister." Nora's laughter spread through the nearest tables almost immediately. "Commander Natalie Young," she repeated, shaking her head with amused disbelief. "My sister cannot even organize a family dinner 6 months in advance because she is always working. Whoever you are looking for, I promise it is not her." A few relatives chuckled politely, assuming the misunderstanding would be cleared up within seconds. Brandon shifted uneasily beside his wife, forcing a smile that looked more uncertain than amused. My father remained standing near the podium, his expression changing from relaxed curiosity to quiet confusion. My mother glanced between Nora and me as though waiting for someone to explain what was happening. I remained exactly where I was, my hands loosely wrapped around my coffee cup. The silver-haired woman did not react to Nora's comment. Instead, she simply looked toward the banquet manager, who answered with respectful confidence. "Yes, ma'am. Commander Natalie Young arrived earlier this evening with her family." The woman nodded once, then allowed her eyes to move slowly across the room until they rested on me. Her calm smile widened almost imperceptibly. She had recognized me immediately. Before she could take another step, Nora laughed again, louder this time, trying to rescue the room from the awkward silence. "I am sorry," she said, speaking directly to the woman. "There has to be another Natalie Young. My sister has a regular office job. She travels all the time, but nothing like, whatever this is." She gestured lightly with both hands as though the entire misunderstanding were harmless entertainment. Several guests exchanged uncertain smiles, unsure whether they should laugh with her or remain quiet. The silver-haired woman listened patiently without interrupting. Her composure never changed. She did not appear offended. She simply waited until Nora finished speaking. Then she answered in a voice so calm that everyone nearby instinctively stopped whispering. "Thank you for your concern," she said graciously. "I am quite certain I am looking for the correct person." Nora blinked once, surprised that her confidence had not ended the conversation. "Are you sure?" she asked, with an embarrassed laugh. "Because my sister," she glanced toward me before continuing, "is very private. We would definitely know if she held a title like commander." The woman smiled politely. "Some people choose not to discuss their professional responsibilities during family celebrations." Those words settled over the room with unexpected weight. My father slowly turned toward me. He was not suspicious. He simply looked puzzled, as though trying to fit together pieces of a picture he had never realized were missing. I could almost hear the questions forming in his mind. My mother folded her hands together, searching my face for reassurance. Across the ballroom, Michael quietly asked another employee to pause serving dessert, sensing that something important was unfolding. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even conversations at the far tables gradually faded as guests realized everyone's attention had shifted toward our family. Nora refused to surrender the moment. "Well," she said with another practiced smile, "Natalie has always been good at keeping secrets." Her tone carried just enough humor to invite another laugh, but this time almost no one responded. Brandon gently touched her elbow. Maybe we should just let them talk. She looked at him in surprise before forcing another smile. I am only trying to help. I appreciated that he had spoken, even quietly. It was the first time all evening anyone had suggested allowing the conversation to unfold naturally instead of turning it into another joke. The silver-haired woman took one measured step farther into the ballroom. She never hurried. She never demanded attention. Yet every eye followed her. Would you be so kind, she asked the banquet manager, as to confirm whether Commander Young is available for a brief greeting whenever it is appropriate? Before he could answer, I finally set my coffee cup on the nearby table. The soft sound of porcelain touching would seem strangely loud inside the silent ballroom. I could feel dozens of eyes following even the smallest movement. My heartbeat remained steady. Moments like this had taught me long ago that calm traveled farther than explanations ever could. I looked first toward my father. Tonight had always belonged to him, and I had no intention of allowing anyone to take that away. Dad, I said gently, if you would rather I speak with them later, I am perfectly happy to wait. He stared at me for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. Natalie, he said quietly. Do you know these people? I offered him the same small smile I had worn through every awkward conversation that evening. Yes. He searched my face again. For how long? Several years. A ripple of whispers spread through the ballroom. My mother looked completely bewildered. Aunt Denise covered her mouth in surprise. Addison glanced from me to Nora and back again without saying a word. Nora herself stood frozen, still trying to convince herself there had to be another explanation. Natalie, she said with a nervous laugh that sounded far less confident than before, what exactly is going on? I met her eyes without anger or satisfaction. I promise I will explain everything. The silver-haired woman remained exactly where she was, never interrupting, never inserting herself into our family conversation. She simply waited with remarkable patience, as though she understood that some moments belonged to families before they belonged to anyone else. My father inhaled slowly, then nodded once. Go ahead, he said softly. If they came here for you, they should not have to wait. I gave him a grateful smile, straightened my shoulders, and quietly stepped away from the table as the distinguished woman met my eyes and began walking toward me. The distance between us was no more than 20 feet, yet it felt as though the entire ballroom had fallen away until only the two of us remained. Every conversation had stopped. Every glass had been lowered. Even the musicians in the corner seemed to understand that something unexpected was unfolding. The distinguished woman approached with measured confidence, her colleagues remaining several respectful steps behind her. She smiled the same warm, composed smile I remembered from years earlier. When she reached me, she paused for a brief moment, meeting my eyes before speaking. Commander Young, she said with unmistakable sincerity, it is wonderful to see you again. Instead of extending her hand immediately, she stood straight for a moment in a formal gesture of respect that reflected the customs of our organization. It was subtle, dignified, and impossible to misunderstand. Only then did she offer her hand, which I accepted with a smile. It is good to see you as well, Director Cruz, I replied. I was not expecting to see you here tonight. A quiet murmur swept across the ballroom. My father looked from me to the woman with widening eyes. My mother blinked several times, clearly trying to process what she had just witnessed. Nora stood perfectly still. The confident smile she had worn all evening disappeared, replaced by confusion she could no longer hide. Director Cruz turned toward my parents before speaking again. Please forgive the interruption. We learned Commander Young was here celebrating her father's retirement, and several of us felt it would be wrong to leave without personally thanking her. My father instinctively stepped forward. I am Walter Young, he said. Natalie's father. Director Cruz smiled warmly. Mr. Young, it is an honor to meet you. You should be extraordinarily proud of your daughter. My father glanced toward me, then back to her. I am not sure I understand. She nodded with complete understanding. That is entirely understandable. Commander Young does not often speak about her work outside the people directly involved. Nora finally found her voice again. "Excuse me," she said with an uneasy laugh, "I think there has been some misunderstanding. Natalie works in emergency management, does she not?" I looked toward my sister calmly. "Yes." She frowned slightly, relieved for only a second. "See? I told everyone she had an office job." Director Cruz answered gently before I could. "Emergency management is correct. Commander Young serves as a regional operational leader within the National Emergency Response Corps, coordinating large-scale disaster response and interagency emergency operations. Her position requires directing teams from multiple federal, state, and local organizations whenever communities face major emergencies." The room became completely silent. Several relatives exchanged stunned glances. Aunt Denise quietly lowered her fork onto her plate without taking her eyes off me. Brandon looked toward Nora, whose expression had shifted from disbelief to uncertainty. My mother whispered almost to herself, "That cannot be the work she leaves for every few weeks." Director Cruz smiled kindly. "Actually, those deployments are often exactly why she travels." She turned back toward me. "Your team still speaks about the mountain wildfire response. I have never forgotten how calmly you kept every agency working together under extraordinary pressure." I offered a modest smile. "Everyone involved did their part." "That is exactly what you always say," she replied. "You never take credit for yourself." My father slowly walked closer until he stood beside me. "Natalie," he asked quietly, "is this really what you have been doing all these years?" I nodded. "Yes, Dad. Why did you never tell us?" I hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "Because every mission involves many people. I never wanted family dinners to become conversations about my work. I wanted them to stay about family." My father stared at me without speaking. It was not disappointment I saw in his eyes. It was the realization that there was an entire part of my life he had never known existed. Director Cruz reached into the portfolio one of her colleagues had been carrying and removed a simple framed certificate. "Our regional leadership committee met in the adjoining ballroom earlier this evening, and this certificate was among the commendations being finalized for next month's conference," she said. "When we learned Commander Young was here with her family, I felt they deserved to see it before we left." She handed the frame to my father. His hands trembled slightly as he read the inscription recognizing years of distinguished leadership, exceptional public service, and unwavering commitment to protecting communities during emergencies across the country. He looked at me again, visibly emotional. Around us, relatives leaned forward, trying to read the certificate from where they stood. Nora remained motionless. For the first time in her life, she seemed unable to think of anything to say. Director Cruz continued with quiet pride. "There is one thing I hope you all understand. The title of commander is not simply an administrative position. It is earned through years of trust, judgment, and the willingness to place the needs of complete strangers ahead of personal comfort. Those who serve under Commander Young respect her because she always walks into the difficult situations before asking anyone else to do the same." My mother covered her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes. Brandon looked at me with genuine admiration. Even guests who had never met me before began applauding softly, the applause gradually spreading across the ballroom until nearly everyone had joined in. I felt my face grow warm with embarrassment. Recognition had never been something I sought, especially not tonight. I gently raised my hand. "Please," I said with a smile, "this evening belongs to my father." The applause slowly faded. Director Cruz nodded appreciatively. Exactly the response I expected. She smiled once more before adding, "There is one story your family has never heard, and I believe they deserve to know it. It explains why everyone in our organization speaks your name with such respect." My father looked from her to me with quiet anticipation, while Nora stood frozen, realizing that everything she thought she knew about her older sister had only been the smallest visible part of a much larger life. The ballroom remained completely still after Director Cruz's final sentence. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody returned to their conversations. Even the servers quietly waited along the walls, sensing that every person in the room wanted to hear what came next. I felt a familiar discomfort settle in my chest. Recognition had never been easy for me, especially when it involved people I loved. "Director Cruz," I said gently, "tonight was meant to celebrate my father. We really do not need to make this about me." She smiled with understanding. "Commander Young, I promise this is not about recognition. It is about helping your family understand why so many people hold you in such high regard." She turned toward my father before continuing. "Mr. Young, over the past decade your daughter has helped coordinate emergency operations after hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, flooding, and other large-scale disasters. She has spent countless nights inside emergency coordination centers making decisions that affected entire communities. Most people never knew her name because our work is not designed to make individuals famous. It is designed to help people recover." My father listened without blinking. Every time Natalie told us she had another work trip. Many of those trips were emergency deployments, Director Cruz answered. Sometimes she left with only a few hours of notice. My mother slowly sat down, her eyes never leaving me. "Those holidays," she whispered. "The birthdays you missed." I nodded quietly. "I always wanted to be here." She looked down at her hands. "I thought work simply mattered more." "Family always mattered more," I answered softly. "Sometimes people needed help before I could come home." A heavy silence followed. There was no accusation in my words, only honesty. Across the room, Nora folded her arms, still trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the woman everyone else seemed to recognize. "Emergency management is important," she finally said, choosing her words carefully, "but surely there are many people doing the same job." Director Cruz nodded. "There are many dedicated professionals. Commander Young earned her position because she consistently brought people together when cooperation mattered most. During complex operations, dozens of organizations often have different priorities. Her greatest strength has never been giving orders. It has been earning trust." Brandon looked genuinely curious. "How does someone even learn to do that?" "By listening before speaking," Director Cruz replied. "By remaining calm when everyone else feels overwhelmed. By accepting responsibility instead of seeking praise." I lowered my eyes, hoping the conversation would move away from me. Instead, one of Director Cruz's colleagues smiled warmly. "May I tell them about the River Valley response?" Director Cruz looked toward me first. I hesitated for a moment before giving a small nod. "Keep it brief." He smiled. "Several years ago, severe flooding affected multiple counties. Representatives from different agencies had reached a point where almost every meeting ended in disagreement. Resources were limited, emotions were running high, and everyone believed their community should receive help first. Commander Young asked every leader in the room to stop talking about their own counties for just 5 minutes and instead describe what worried them most about the people they served. The atmosphere changed completely. By the end of that meeting they were sharing equipment, personnel, and information instead of competing with one another. The operational plan created that afternoon became the model used throughout the remainder of the response. Several guests quietly nodded as they listened. There was nothing dramatic about the story. There were no impossible heroics. It was simply a reminder that leadership often looked quieter than people expected. My father smiled faintly, almost to himself. "That sounds like Natalie," he said. "Even when she was little, she always tried to make everyone stop arguing." A few relatives laughed softly, remembering childhood moments I had almost forgotten myself. For the first time that evening, the laughter carried warmth instead of judgment. Halfway through the conversation, Addison looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Is that why you always looked exhausted when you came home?" I smiled apologetically. "Sometimes the work involved very long days." "And you never wanted sympathy," she said. "No," I answered. "Everyone has responsibilities. Mine simply happened to be less visible." Nora remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had defined her throughout the evening had given way to something much more complicated. She was not angry. She simply looked lost, as though years of assumptions were quietly falling apart one piece at a time. My mother suddenly looked up again. "Natalie, there were so many times I told you to slow down, to find a quieter job, to stay closer to home." "I know." Tears formed in her eyes. "You never once corrected me." I smiled gently. "You were speaking from love. There was nothing to correct." Director Cruz watched the exchange with quiet respect before speaking once more. "There is another reason Commander Young rarely discusses her work. She has always believed that the people affected by disasters deserve privacy and dignity. She never wanted difficult moments in other people's lives to become stories told at social gatherings." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It carried understanding instead of confusion. My father looked down at the framed certificate still resting in his hands. He traced the edge of the frame slowly before raising his eyes toward me. "Natalie," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "there is something I have just realized, and I need to ask you about it." His expression shifted as though an old memory had suddenly returned with perfect clarity. I recognized that look immediately because I knew exactly which memory had found him, and I quietly wondered whether tonight was finally the night he would discover the truth I had protected from him for more than a year. My father held the framed certificate in both hands for several long seconds before finally looking up at me. His expression was no longer one of confusion. It was the expression of someone revisiting an old memory that had never quite made sense until this very moment. "Natalie," he asked quietly, "about a year ago, when the hospital suddenly called and told me there was a community support program that covered almost everything my insurance did not, was that because of you?" The question settled over the ballroom with surprising weight. My mother immediately looked at me. Nora turned just as quickly. I had hoped that subject would never become part of this evening, but I could already tell there was no reason to avoid it anymore. Before I answered, Director Cruz glanced toward me, silently asking whether she should remain quiet. I offered the smallest nod. She understood immediately. "Mr. Young," she said gently, "I believe your daughter would rather tell that story herself if she chooses." I took a slow breath before speaking. "Dad, Mom mentioned during one of our calls that your rehabilitation paperwork had been routed between several departments and no one seemed to know where the complete file was. I contacted the hospital's patient assistance office through the same public process available to any family member and asked only that the missing documents be routed to the correct department." My father stared at me. "You mean, you never asked anyone to break the rules?" "No," I answered immediately. "Everything followed the normal process. I simply made sure the right people knew the file was waiting. Once they reviewed it, you qualified on your own." His shoulders slowly relaxed. "Why did you never tell us?" I smiled softly. "Because it was never supposed to be about me." Tears gathered in my mother's eyes almost instantly. "Natalie, all this time I kept thanking the hospital staff for finding that program." "You should thank them," I replied. "They were the ones who helped you. I only connected people who were already trying to do the right thing." Director Cruz smiled quietly. "That answer explains exactly why Commander Young has earned so much respect." My father lowered his head for a moment. "I remember calling you that week," he said slowly. "You told me you were too busy to come home because work needed you." I nodded. I was already working 16-hour days coordinating emergency operations. He looked back at me. "And in the middle of all that, you still found time to help me. You are my father." Those 4 words were all I needed to say. He closed his eyes briefly, overcome by emotion. Around the ballroom, several relatives quietly wiped away tears. Even guests who had never met our family before seemed deeply moved by the conversation. Halfway across the room, Nora remained completely silent. She no longer looked embarrassed. She looked thoughtful. For perhaps the first time in years, she was replaying dozens of conversations in her own mind. Birthdays Natalie had missed. Holidays shortened by unexpected flights. Phone calls that ended because work required immediate attention. None of those moments had been excuses. They had been responsibilities she had simply never spoken about. Brandon gently reached for her hand beneath the table. She did not pull away. Instead, she whispered almost to herself, "I never even asked where she was going." He answered quietly, "None of us did." Those words lingered in the silence between them. My mother slowly walked toward me until only a few feet separated us. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling. "So many times I told you to stop working so hard. I kept comparing your life to Nora's because I thought you were sacrificing your happiness for a career that was not worth it." I reached for her hands. "Mom, you never needed to apologize for loving me. But I judged you without understanding you. You wanted me to have an easier life. I always knew that." She wrapped her arms around me, holding me far longer than she usually did. It was not simply an embrace. It felt like years of misunderstanding quietly melting away without another word needing to be spoken. When she finally stepped back, my father approached next. He looked at me with unmistakable pride, but there was also regret in his eyes. "I thought I knew my own daughter," he admitted. "You knew the part one wanted you to know." "Why?" he asked gently. "Why keep so much hidden?" I smiled. "Because I never wanted my family to feel that every dinner, every birthday, or every holiday had to become a conversation about my work. I wanted to come home as your daughter, not as someone with a title." Director Cruz nodded. "That has always been her philosophy. She leaves her position at the door whenever she visits the people she loves." The ballroom grew quiet once again, but this silence carried warmth instead of uncertainty. Then Director Cruz looked toward my father with an expression that became unexpectedly serious. "Mr. Young," she said carefully, "there is one deployment your daughter has never described to you. I have respected her privacy, but with her permission, I believe it may help you understand what those long absences required of her." I immediately turned toward her. "Director Cruz." She met my eyes kindly. "I know you never wanted them to hear this from anyone else. But sometimes families deserve the chance to understand what a person's quiet choices have cost them." My heartbeat slowed as I realized exactly which memory she was about to reveal. I had kept it from my parents because I never wanted them to spend another day worrying about me after it was already over. My father noticed the change in my expression immediately. "Natalie," he asked softly, "what have you never told us?" Director Cruz held my gaze for a long moment before offering me a reassuring smile. She understood why I had kept that part of my life private, and she also understood why my parents deserved to hear it now. I let out a slow breath. "It is all right," I said quietly. "You can tell them." She nodded gratefully before turning back to my family. About 18 months ago, Commander Young led a multi-agency emergency coordination effort after a series of severe storms affected several communities across 2 states. The operation lasted nearly 2 weeks. It required around-the-clock planning, constant communication with local officials, and hundreds of difficult decisions. The public only saw emergency vehicles, shelters, and recovery crews. They never saw the people inside the coordination center who kept everything moving. My father listened without saying a word. My mother reached for his hand. Director Cruz continued calmly. "During that operation, Commander Young worked almost continuously because every hour mattered. She never complained. She never asked to be replaced. The only request she made was that someone remind her to call home after things had stabilized because she knew her parents would worry if they realized how long she had been away." My mother covered her mouth as fresh tears appeared. "She was thinking about us?" Director Cruz smiled gently. "Constantly." I lowered my eyes, feeling slightly embarrassed. "It was nothing unusual," I said. "Everyone on the team was making sacrifices." "That is exactly what you always say," Director Cruz replied. "You always make everyone else's contribution sound larger than your own." A quiet laugh spread through several guests, breaking the tension for just a moment. Then Director Cruz's expression grew thoughtful. "Again. There was another moment from that deployment that your family should know. Near the end of the response, one of the younger coordinators became overwhelmed. It was his first major emergency assignment, and he believed he had made a mistake that would delay critical resources. The discrepancy had been caught before any shipment was delayed, but he did not know that yet and had already convinced himself that the entire failure was his fault. He was convinced his career was over. Brandon leaned forward with genuine interest. What happened? Commander Young did not criticize him, Director Cruz answered. She asked everyone else to leave the room for 5 minutes. When they returned, the young coordinator had regained his confidence and continued working. Months later he told me those 5 minutes changed his entire career. He said Commander Young reminded him that good leaders do not expect perfection. They expect honesty, accountability, and the willingness to keep learning. I smiled faintly. He became an excellent coordinator. He certainly did, Director Cruz replied. He now trains others using the same approach you showed him. My father looked at me with quiet amazement. You never told us any of this. Those stories belong to the people who lived them with me, I answered. Not to dinner conversations. The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt peaceful. Many of my relatives no longer looked surprised. They simply looked as though they were seeing me clearly for the first time. Halfway across the ballroom, Nora slowly stood from her chair. Every eye followed her as she walked toward me. The confidence that usually defined every step had disappeared. She stopped only a few feet away, her voice softer than I had heard in years. Natalie. I owe you an apology. I shook my head gently. You do not have to do this in front of everyone. Yes, she answered. I really do. She looked around the ballroom before returning her eyes to mine. All evening I joked about your clothes, your job, your travel, and your life because I believed I understood you. The truth is, I never even tried. Nobody interrupted her. Even the musicians remained completely still. Nora took another slow breath. I kept measuring success by houses, vacations, expensive cars, and social media pictures. I thought you were always missing out. I never stopped to wonder whether you were simply spending your life differently than I was. Her words carried no excuses, only honesty. I smiled warmly. Nora, you never embarrassed me. She looked confused. I did. I gently shook my head. No. You only showed everyone the person you believed I was. That is different. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. Can you forgive me? I reached forward without hesitation and took both of her hands. I forgive you. But I would rather we build something more honest from here than pretend one apology can erase every year we misunderstood each other. She laughed through her tears, then pulled me into a long embrace. Around us, quiet applause began once again, not because of my career, but because two sisters were finally understanding each other after years of assumptions. My father wiped his eyes before smiling at both of us. This, he whispered, is the best retirement gift I could have imagined. Laughter spread gently throughout the ballroom as conversations slowly resumed. Guests returned to their tables, dessert was finally served, and the musicians quietly began playing again. The celebration no longer felt interrupted. Somehow it felt more complete than it had before. Director Cruz prepared to leave with her colleagues, but before she reached the entrance she turned back one last time. Commander Young, she said with a warm smile, we will see you at next month's leadership conference. I will be there, I replied. After she departed, my father remained unusually quiet. He continued looking at the framed certificate before carefully placing it beside his dinner plate. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he slipped his hand into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and touched something he had carried with him all evening. His expression softened in a way I had not seen since I was a little girl. He looked up at me, smiled through tears, and said, Natalie, there is something I have been saving for many years. Tonight I finally know who it has always belonged to. My father slowly removed a small velvet box from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and held it carefully in both hands as though it carried years of memories instead of something valuable. Every conversation in the ballroom faded once again. He looked down at the box for a long moment before opening it. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch with a simple engraved cover. It was beautifully maintained despite its age. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my grandfather, and after he passed away, my father had carried it with him to every major milestone in his life. As children, Nora and I used to ask about it constantly, and Dad always smiled before saying that one day he would know exactly who should keep it. None of us had ever asked again. He lifted the watch carefully and placed it in my hand. For years, he said softly, I believed I would know the right moment when it arrived. Tonight I finally understand what I was waiting for. I looked at him in surprise. Dad. I cannot take this. He smiled through tears. Yes, you can. He gently closed my fingers around the watch. I spent too many years believing I needed to protect the little girl who always put everyone else first. Somewhere along the way, I failed to notice that she had quietly become the person other families depended on when life became difficult. This belonged to my father. Then it belonged to me. Now I would like it to belong to you. I felt tears filling my eyes before I could answer. I have not done anything to deserve this. He laughed softly. That is exactly why you do. My mother stepped closer, resting one hand on my shoulder. When you were little, she said with a smile, you always wanted to fix things whenever someone cried. You would bring blankets, cookies, stuffed animals, or anything you thought might help. I thought that was just childhood kindness. I never realized you would spend your whole life doing the same thing for complete strangers. I looked down at the watch resting in my palm. It suddenly felt far heavier than silver should have. It carried family history, trust, and love that had quietly survived years of misunderstanding. Nora stepped beside us again. Dad, she said gently, I think you made the right choice. Then she turned toward me with a smile that no longer carried comparison or competition. Natalie, I used to believe people noticed me because I looked successful. Tonight I realized something completely different. The people who truly respected you did not admire what you owned. They admired who you became. I reached over and hugged her once more. There is room for both of us to keep growing. She laughed softly. I hope so. Brandon smiled. I have a feeling family dinners are going to sound very different after tonight. Everyone laughed together, and for the first time that evening the laughter belonged to all of us instead of being directed at anyone. The tension that had quietly shaped our family for years seemed to dissolve into something much warmer. Coffee was poured, photographs resumed, and my father carefully placed Director Cruz's card beside the certificate she had left with him. Throughout the remainder of the evening, no one asked me about titles, awards, or emergency operations. Instead, my cousins asked about childhood memories. My mother wanted to know which pie I still liked best. My father told stories that made everyone laugh until tears formed again, this time from happiness. Nora spent the rest of the evening introducing me to relatives she thought I had not spoken with enough over the years. There was no performance in her voice anymore. Only quiet pride. Several weeks later, my father officially retired. Over the months that followed, life gradually returned to a familiar rhythm, though the way our family spoke to one another had begun to change. I resumed traveling whenever communities needed support. Nora continued building her business, but something about her had changed. Instead of measuring every success by appearances, she quietly began volunteering at local community events on weekends. She never announced it online. She simply showed up. One Saturday morning she called and asked whether I would like to join her after one of my meetings. We spent the afternoon helping organize donated supplies for families recovering from a severe storm. At the end of the day she smiled and said, I think I finally understand why you always came home tired. I smiled back. Sometimes the most meaningful days are the ones nobody else notices. She nodded without another word. The old pocket watch now sits on the bookshelf in my living room. I do not look at it because it reminds me of recognition. I look at it because it reminds me that love can survive misunderstanding, that respect can grow quietly over time, and that families sometimes need truth more than perfect appearances. Whenever I wind it each Sunday evening before another week begins, I remember my father's smile that night and the moment our family finally stopped seeing one another through assumptions and started seeing one another with understanding. Perhaps that is one of the quiet gifts life occasionally offers us. We spend so much time trying to understand the choices people make that we sometimes forget to ask what those choices might have cost them. This story gently reminds us that kindness often works behind the scenes, without applause, recognition, or explanation. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who speak the loudest about what they have done, but the ones who quietly carry responsibilities while still making room for the people they love. There are moments when listening with curiosity instead of certainty can change an entire relationship. A single conversation may never erase years of misunderstanding, yet it can become the beginning of seeing someone with new eyes. Families are rarely perfect, but they often grow stronger when compassion replaces assumption and when love becomes more interested in understanding than comparing. Thank you for spending this journey with Natalie and her family. If you found yourself in Nora's place, how do you think you would have responded after learning the truth? What part of this family's journey stayed with you the longest, and why?